This video took much longer for me to make than I anticipated. Between work, philosophizing with friends, and doing a little research on the author, I think I've got a good perspective on what this book has to offer. Not too long ago, I finished the unabridged edition of Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged. I won't lie, it's giving me a hell of a lot to think about. Individualism, the perils of diehard collectivism, reciprocity, man as a heroic being. There's a lot to unpack, probably too much to cover after only one reading. Much like how I felt after reading The Fountainhead, I don't think I'm going to call myself reborn as an objectivist, per se, but this book has made me really think not just about what it is that I'm doing with my life, but why I'm doing it. The key points that I took away from Atlas Shrugged are what I'll be covering in this video, which will be segmented into 4 separate sections: reciprocity versus collectivism, gods of industry, self-destruction by moral imperative, and my final thoughts on the book itself. I'll do my best to avoid spoilers, but I will be referring to specific events or key scenes from the book in order to explain my rationale. I think it's impossible to do an accurate review of something as dense as Atlas Shrugged without examining certain scenes to make a point. Number 1. Reciprocity versus collectivism. Perhaps the most obvious thing I got from Atlas Shrugged is an emphasis on reciprocal relationships. The ideal form of relationships that Ayn Rand puts forth are those based on reciprocity, the principle of I help you, you help me. Now, fundamentally, that sort of relationship is essentially communism. However, Rand presents a very specific form of reciprocity that emphasizes, for lack of a better word, a person employing someone over using them. To use someone, as Rand sees it, is to demand the acquisition of someone else's skills for your own benefit with no regard for the other's frame of accomplishments. This is built on a philosophy of unbridled altruism, usually backed up with some promise of punishment or a threat, no negotiation permitted. Labor is effectively rendered without value in comparison to the completion of a task, and time spent in this manner is often uncompensated. The person you are using will gain nothing from helping you but a stay of execution at your own hands. Individual agency is essentially stripped away in favor of collective good. If you help me, we'll both be better off. This is the underlying principle that drove the Soviet Union: capitulate and cooperate, or else. This sort of forced reciprocation only breeds resentment that must be kept in check by force, and there is an expectation that someone will help you, and conversely, you help them. The only incentive for either party is not a mutually cooperative relationship, but avoiding the penalties inflicted by a third party. Employment, alternatively, is to request the assistance of one's skills while remaining fully aware of the other's capabilities and limits. You would not ask a carpenter to bake a wedding cake because you know that a carpenter is not always a good baker. However, you might approach a chef to help you build a fence if all you need is a second set of hands. Should the other person be unable to help you or decline the offer, neither party stands anything to lose. Accepting this verbal contract leads to a period of negotiations on which the other person will agree to help. Maybe a family member fixes your car, and you reply with an offer to make them dinner for that evening, a trade of a favor for a favor. And even if they can't do the best job, both parties abide by their agreement, perhaps with some reasonable modifications. Labor, in this sense, retains value compared to the accomplishment, and time spent laboring on a task is compensated. In any sense, the reciprocity that comes from employment is built around the intention of individual agency, the consideration of the self over others, and negotiated voluntary transactions in which people are free to associate with whomever they choose. The forced reciprocity is something I saw entirely too much of while at university. Sure, it was on a small-scale level and relatively harmless, but it was there. Professors in my literary theory and critical theory courses would constantly lecture about how we need to be more mindful, more considerate, and grant some arbitrary group more permissions than we would grant ourselves in the name of something like inclusivity or tolerance. And it was implied that simply being in the classroom meant that you agreed to the otherwise non-existent terms and conditions of whatever social justice they opted to push. Everything you did had to be warped to suit the needs of a minority. There was no way to negotiate on how best to meet these terms, only that you had to do so, and usually by some form of faulty if-then blanket statement. Failure to adhere to this directive of diversity led to some form of social ostracization, the or-else of people being used. I mean, if you don't agree with the students protesting the election of President Trump, you must be against gay rights, and you don't want to be labeled as a homophobe, do you? Voluntary reciprocity, on the other hand, would manifest itself in small, personal interactions between myself and others, and generally led to an amicable or enjoyable relationship between myself and certain roommates I had. One such roommate and I agreed that if he were to buy pasta sauces and I supplied the pasta, we'd split the batches of fettuccine alfredo or pesto linguine, whatever it was that week, as evenly as possible. Never once did we get into an altercation about who used what how many days ago since we negotiated how we'd do things. In other living arrangements, we might trade off on who bought the beer that week. Any breach of these negotiations would not result in immediate threats of bringing in the RA, but a small act of correction, usually in the form of, "Hey dude, I bought last time. It's your turn, pal." In Atlas Shrugged, there's a constant need on the part of the collectivists for something to be done in the name of the common good. What that something is never seems to matter. These collectivists seek out any potential problems and attempt to regulate them, as in the case of Hank Rearden being expected by the state to give some of the steel he produces to Orrin Boyle's smaller, struggling steel mill. Rearden calculates that such a deal would cause his mill to operate at a massive loss, no matter how much the state offers to compensate him. When he refuses, the state responds by ruining his mill. And there you have it again, that forced reciprocity, the expectation for a man to lay down and be used under that jackboot-clad mantra, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. Adherence to a philosophy like this may lead to positive short-term solutions, but always causes far more damage than it could ever be worth. Number 2. Gods of Industry. Looking at the characters of Atlas Shrugged from a literary perspective, they don't come off as what we'd consider to be real characters. Because of the way in which Ayn Rand uses them to portray man as a heroic being, they come off as these people that are almost flawless. However, compare their near perfection to the Olympic pantheon of gods found in classical Greek and Roman mythology. Much like the gods, the characters of Hank Rearden, Dagny Taggart, and Francisco d'Anconia all wield tremendous power in their own rights. Instead of being these mythical forces of nature, Rand's characters represent the forces of modern industrialization. Rearden is a sort of steel god, blessing the masses of the United States with his miraculous Rearden medal. Dagny Taggart commands her railroads and the workers with ruthless but just efficiency. d'Anconia holds sway over the global copper industry, which is the first domino to fall in the economy when he up and vanishes. It seems proper, in my mind, to read these characters as self-made gods of industry. Compare them to modern-day industrial billionaires such as Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, and Elon Musk. We know them for being rich and successful, and that much is true. Elon Musk wouldn't be putting a Tesla Roadster on Mars without his wealth and success, just as Rearden and Taggart would not otherwise be in their own positions without relentless effort and planning. But that is what makes these characters who they are and informs Rand's intentions for what they represent. Rearden, for instance, is the pinnacle of a self-made man. Everything he has done has been the result of his own labor and effort. The success of his steel mill does not depend on anyone else's merits or labors but his own, and Rearden is never afraid to dirty his hands, quite literally in some cases, in order to keep his steel mill in working order. Consider for a moment just how much of the modern world rests on the shoulders of Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos. Musk is not only funding reusable rockets, something that completely blows my mind, but he's also ushering in the development of affordable, roadworthy electric cars. Think of how much of a benefit it would be to have reusable interstellar rockets, what that would allow us to do in 10, 20, 30 years' time. Much like Rearden's miraculous alloy, what Musk has to offer is nothing short of a massive boon to humanity. It seems strange that, and this is coming from what was being pushed at university, that we are being taught to be envious and wary of these successful people, even despise them. The man in the crisp black suit and red tie is made to be the man, a symbol of the affluential exploiting the little man and someone who must be fought at every single chance available. These are the people that live only for profit, cutting the throats of anyone who might stand in their way. Anyone who thinks this to be true is either someone who has never taken a business class, or more likely, never been made to work with their hands. My mythology instructor this past quarter said something rather profound one day in class, something that exposed just how pointlessly anti-business this man was. "You know," he began, "if you look at how much the rich pay in taxes compared to how much they make, it's utterly revolting." This, coming from a man in a clean, pressed Armani three-piece suit, complete with a gold chain and pocket watch, who had just told us about how he'd blown several $1,000s on a 19th century painting of Joseph and Potiphar's wife. Now I don't know about you, but compared to a ramen-slurping college student, I'd go so far as to consider him to be loaded with cash if he can afford such a thing. Hypocrisy, thy name is college professor. There is no reason for us to be fearful nor loathing of the successful man, and no reason that we should assume every rich person is out to get anyone who makes a lesser salary. The only charitable assumption to make is that anyone who is rich has rightfully earned their living. Except you, Logan Paul. Both my father and my uncle make a killer salary as engineers aboard cargo ships and tankers. I suppose to Rand they might be the near epitome of the working man. While they produce nothing in a sense, their knowledge of ship engine blocks and willingness to work with their hands makes them valuable beyond compare. Now who are they exploiting with their success? My family runs a very small but successful company, and we do very well, keeping our workers paid and delivering a product that people enjoy. If we truly were exploiting our workers, I can assure you we'd have 0 employees whatsoever. In short, what makes the characters of Atlas Shrugged compelling to read about is not some supernatural abilities nor the character traits they possess. In some cases, the protagonists can come off as rather dislikable. What they never let go of, however, is their conscience. In the face of immense pressure, they never bend to the will of irrational, emotional responses. Everything has to do with long-term goals and cementing plans for the future. Even when facing immense pressure from a power as overruling as the state, they will not compromise themselves and their own principles. Number 3. Self-destruction by moral imperative. The main antagonists of Atlas Shrugged are the representatives of the Unification Board, a collective of politicians hell-bent on socializing the United States in the name of the common good. Every regulation they pass, every law that they make, revolves around the imperative that in the event of any crisis, any solution in the name of the common good is better than doing nothing. These decisions, made essentially at the pull of a legislative hair trigger, end up making things exponentially worse across time. In trying to make steel mills and farms equitable in their output, this instead causes a decrease in both the quality of what is produced and what is available for the masses. Because these businesses are intended to balance each other out, one might think that this equity would lead to economic stability, but the opposite is true. Forcing a business to run at a loss would cause economic havoc, as Rand rightly predicts through Reardon. The protagonists contain an unyielding will to stand against a government that seeks to impose upon them a moral standard that violates their own principles. Ragnar Danaskjöld, a pirate in this sci-fi setting, assaults industries taken over by the collectivist government and plunders the wealth of the state. He delivers a particularly striking monologue about Robin Hood and the fallacy of the statement, "Steal from the rich, give to the poor." The implication of this statement is that anyone who is rich is inherently evil, and anyone who is poor is inherently good. Much like a statistical average, this statement cannot be applied accurately to any individual. It only seems logical when applied to a faceless mass with a title. Danaskjöld's philosophy is one that gave me a new perspective on the tale of Robin Hood. We've all been raised with this idea that Robin Hood was a man of the people, a swashbuckling hero who stole money from the rich and returned it to the poor. Now this sounds like a little fairy tale on the surface of a morally pure hero fighting the corrupting power of money and giving that money to those that need it. Morally speaking, that sounds like a good thing. But let's consider what we understand Robin Hood as, and consider what he stands for purely from a narrative or mythological standpoint, for lack of a better term. I understand that he may have been a true historical figure, but over time, Robin Hood has been blown up into what I would consider a legendary mythological hero. I got into a discussion with someone on Twitter about the morality of wealth. They argued that anyone rich, specifically Elon Musk, has a moral duty to use their money in a way that helps humanity, specifically those who are poorer than themselves. They would go on to say that they believed failure to do so should be illegal and punishable with a fine or even jail time. That seemed a very strange concept to me. Throw someone in jail for being rich? What kind of a crime is that? And what constitutes a help to humanity? That's a very open-ended term. Rather than swim in a bank vault full of dollar bills, Elon Musk is using his immense wealth to develop emission-free electric cars and reusable rocketry, something that NASA should have been able to do years ago with the amount of government funding they receive. On a basic level, what Musk is investing his money in is environmental protection. Whether you're against the idea of man-made climate change or for it, consider this. Reusable rocketry would lessen the demand for rocket materials, allowing more of those materials to be available for other needs. The same can be said of electric cars and engine parts, not to mention the fact that there would be the exchange of greenhouse gases for reusable electric batteries. How does this sort of environmental protection fail to qualify as a benefit to humanity? And for that matter, Who has the right to dictate what another person does with their own money? Imagine for a moment that you get a nice solid paycheck for $2,000 after a long month of work. Would you like it if someone came along and demanded you or forced you to give half of that paycheck to a random charity or cause? It's one thing if you choose to give to a charity of your own volition. That's your decision. It's quite another for anyone else to dictate what you do with your earnings. What Rand argues is this: no one, individual or state, has any right to anyone else's profits. Elon Musk is choosing to spend his earnings as he sees fit by cornering a market that no one else has tried to tackle. The man is making personal flamethrowers, for fuck's sake. The person I was discussing this with didn't see that as important, instead choosing to cite Tesla's lack of unionization and immense wealth as making him inherently evil. I was too busy laughing to explain that Tesla factories are almost completely automated. I mean, what are we going to do? Unionize robot arms? That's not going to go anywhere. This same sort of moral imperative that came up with this person on Twitter is one that I would see student activists demonstrating about when it came to any sort of political issue. We need representation in Field A by Group 1 because if we do that, everything will somehow become better. Everything might be great now as it is, but because I don't like this one thing, the entire system needs to be upset. If you disagree with me, you're heartless, cruel, and selfish. What is evil then, I ask? To allow everyone to live as individuals and operate on their own terms, or to make them conform to some social group because of arbitrary characteristics or social status? Back to Ragnar Danaskjöld and Robin Hood. Stealing from the rich and giving to the poor. Well, who's rich? Who's poor? Why do the rich deserve to have their wealth confiscated? What if Robin Hood steals from a merchant who deals in honest trade and gives the money to a peasant with horrible spending habits? Is that still a morally defensive action if the victim didn't deserve it? To me, such a thing sounds like the financial equivalent of murder. Ragnar Danaskjöld takes this idea of Robin Hood as a noble figure and turns it on its head. Now sure, Robin Hood stole from the taxman and the king, and that in and of itself can be considered at least a morally defensive act if the state is corrupt. But the moral of Robin Hood is not steal from the state, give to the citizen. The equivocation of rich with evil and poor with good is not something that can be applied to every single rich person. Who is Elon Musk exploiting if the labor in his factories is comprised almost entirely of machines? Instead of stealing from the rich and giving to the poor, Danaskjöld steals from the corrupt and gives to the honest. As the power of the state grows and its enforced collectivism swallows up industry after industry, Danaskjöld sabotages copper shipments and steel mills, plundering their wealth and returning money not to the downtrodden citizens living off government welfare, but the displaced gods of industry, those who have a grand plan and can offer up something of value to the people but have been halted by the state. The reason for this is not that the people running the steel mills are corrupt, but the state controlling them has become so. What these industries have to offer up is a gift to humanity, and for them to turn their power over to the state is an act of capitulation that ultimately squanders their potential. Consider for a moment the make and model of a car during a severe economic downturn. For an example, let's use Chevrolet. One day you hear that the government has bought the Chevrolet company and intends to take over manufacturing of all Chevrolet vehicles from here on out, with the end goal of granting the company a huge financial boost. Now consider the interior of your average DMV. Bland, colorless, walls that are painted some pale shade of teal, take a number and shuffle on. This is what the state considers to be quality. Chevy sports cars would probably start to resemble the Lada sedans of the Soviet Union as the state tries to cut costs and turn a profit for itself at the company's expense. Suddenly vehicles from other manufacturers look much more attractive. The streak of individualism brought about by a sporty red Corvette or a glistening green Camaro will be stripped away in favor of a few dollars more, becoming watered-down, mass-produced contraptions of scrap. In a sense, that's what Rand gets at with her future of economic equity, and that is what Danaskjöld chooses to fight. To sacrifice yourself for a greater good will only bring about immediate benefits, but in the long run your labors will only go to someone who does not deserve it. To purely live for the greater good, the overarching moral imperative that drives collectivism without regard for yourself and your own needs, will only lead to self-destruction. Number 4. Final thoughts. Having read both Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead, I think there's a large degree of misinterpretation when it comes to objectivism. Rand writes about the uncompromising union of mind and ego in these two stories, and I think the way she focuses on ego is what makes some people misinterpret her philosophy. When one hears egoism, that being the idea of living for yourself, she does not mean that the best possible mode of being is to cut everyone else out and do everything yourself. This is ultimately an unachievable goal. You can pick up many skills in your lifetime, true, but you cannot do everything yourself. Additionally, I think there's a sort of false equivalence of egoism with selfishness. These two are not the same thing. Selfishness implies a complete disregard for others in the name of self-gratification, but we can see from Atlas Shrugged that Rand's characters cannot operate completely on their own, and as such act with great regard for others. Dagny Taggart, with all her knowledge of trains and track, could not run Taggart Transcontinental without the help of Eddie Willers. The egoism that Rand espouses is one that allows you to help yourself while not bleeding others dry. In a sense, it is acting selfishly, but it's a type of selfishness that doesn't lead to immediate self-gratification, which in turn avoids the self-destruction that comes with what we know to be selfishness. Rand's characters recognize, appreciate, and try to make use of what those around them have to offer, rather than work their co-workers overtime simply to benefit themselves. The focus of Rand's egoism and objectivism, at least as I see it based on her books, is to never take yourself out of the equation. Altruism, the act of living completely selflessly, is to remove yourself from the equation. You must always be conscious of the ramifications any decision can have on yourself, rather than acting blindly on orders or jumping to emotional outcomes. You should also be mindful of the talents of those around you and utilize them if you can in a manner that is reciprocal instead of tyrannical. If you're given an order that you know to be wrong, don't follow it. If your job is rewarding you unfairly, leave it. If your boss is exploiting you at work, don't continue to work for him. Personally speaking, having been mired in a culture that preached boundless altruism without stable justification, Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead were breaths of fresh air compared to the dense postmodern essays on socialist feminism and the shallow genius of Karl Marx that my literary theory and multicultural literature professors subjected me to. Rand's ideas not only ran contrary to these ideas, but were also offered up with a substantial why behind the what. It answered a lot of questions for me that my professors were never willing to explore. Honestly, I think that this is a book everyone should read. If Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto is the Bible of socialism and collectivism, Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged is its antithesis. It's her answer to communism, what some might consider Russian conservatism, but nonetheless, it's an enjoyable, thought-provoking book from start to finish. Now, like I said in the beginning, I don't think I'm going to suddenly call myself an objectivist, but this book has changed my outlook on how I see the world. Thank you so very much for watching. Go ahead and subscribe for more content, hit that like button if you enjoyed this video, or leave me a comment to let me know about your own thoughts on the matter. Good hunting to you, and I'll see you on the next one.